Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I'm so glad you've joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lovers all around the world. In the idyllic village of Lavenford, a historic stone chapel hosted a private ceremony, a honeymoon blessing for the newlyweds. But when the groom vanished by morning and the bride was found wandering barefoot among the pews, Miss Marple suspected the vows spoken beneath those stained glass windows had masked something far more sinister. Miss Marple and the Chapel of Cold Intentions. Chapter 1. A Room with a Broken View. It was the first Monday of June, and the village of Wetherham-by-Sea basked under a deceiving morning sun. A place known mostly for its ancient stone walls, overgrown hedgerows and wind-carved cliffs, it was the kind of sleepy English coastal village where nothing much happened, except when it did. Miss Jane Marple, modestly dressed in her dove-grey travelling suit, stepped out of the taxi that had brought her from the small railway station. She paused outside the Gull's Nest, a handsome, refurbished Victorian guesthouse perched precariously near the edge of bramble cliffs. Seagulls wheeled overhead, and the salty air was thick with the scent of sea thrift and brewing rain. She had come, not for mystery, but for rest, visiting her godson Julian's wife's cousin, Mrs. Harriet Fanshawe, who now ran the place. The Gull's Nest had recently been restored and repurposed into a guest house, and although its plumbing was as temperamental as the sea, it offered quiet rooms, scenic views, and plenty of hot tea. Mrs. Fanshawe, a round woman with anxious eyes, greeted her warmly. "Jane, you've come just in time. This weekend has been terribly odd." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You don't say, Harriet. That's rare for a place like this, isn't it?" "Oh, nothing too dreadful," Harriet said quickly, leading her up the creaky stairs. "Just odd things. One of our honeymooning couples left this morning. Very early, without breakfast or goodbye. Unusual, don't you think?" Miss Marple smiled politely. "Most honeymooners are unpredictable, though I do find the details of their comings and goings often quite interesting." Her room was at the front of the house, facing the moor. The lace curtains stirred faintly in the sea breeze. After unpacking her few belongings, she sat by the window with her knitting and a view of the garden path below. That's when she first saw them, a young man in a dark wool coat and a woman in lilac, neither of them speaking, just walking along the edge of the cliff, the woman leading slightly ahead. A couple, certainly, but not a happy one. That evening, while sipping warm broth by the fireplace in the parlour, Miss Marple caught wind of a quiet argument behind the kitchen door. It left the room in a state, wrinkled sheets, mirror tilted, and the breakfast trays untouched, whispered the housekeeper Nora. Miss Marple turned a page of her book, pretending not to listen. "Did they leave a note?" asked a male voice, likely the gardener. "No," said Nora. "They were supposed to stay till Thursday, and they never asked for a taxi." The next morning brought a stormy shift in weather and in tone. A local farmer arrived mid-morning, boots muddy, cap in hand. "Mrs. Fanshawe," he said gravely, "I found something troubling out by Drift Hollow. A coat, bloodied, looked fresh." Miss Marple put down her embroidery. "Drift Hollow?" she asked gently. "Isn't that the path with the old tin mines?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "And the cliffs, dangerous ground." Police arrived by mid-afternoon. Constable Green, young and overly formal, asked a dozen questions of Harriet and the house staff. By evening, it was confirmed that the coat found at the cliff's edge belonged to Edward Marchmont, husband to Clara Marchmont, the woman in lilac. His suitcase was still in the room. So was hers. But Clara was nowhere to be found. Miss Marple said little during dinner, but her mind ticked quietly. Edward Marchmont, Clara Marchmont, married barely a fortnight, booked into the Gull's Nest under Clara's handwriting according to the guest ledger, and now one coat, bloodied, one missing woman, no witnesses. After tea, she went to the drawing room and, under pretense of retrieving her misplaced spectacles, slipped quietly behind the reception counter. Tucked between unused postcards and receipts was something peculiar. A folded tourist map, stained faintly with ink. Red circles had been drawn around 3 sites: the old chapel ruins, the tin mine shaft, and Drift Hollow. Odd choices for honeymoon sightseeing. She took the map, slipped it beneath her knitting pattern, and returned to her seat by the fire. That night, the wind howled against the inn's windows like a living thing. Thunder rolled over the sea. Somewhere in the moors, a storm was brewing, and Miss Marple, peering over her glasses at the flames, suspected it had already broken. As she sipped her bedtime cocoa, she murmured, "Funny thing about honeymoons. They often reveal what the engagement kept hidden." And with that, the mystery had begun. Chapter 2. Before the Rain Fell. The cocoa had gone cold on Miss Marple's side table, but her thoughts had only just begun to warm. The map with its red ink markings sat folded beneath her notebook. 3 places, 3 potential answers. She reviewed them silently in her mind as the storm outside quieted into a slow, heavy drizzle. Morning came with a hush. The wind had retired, but the sea still hissed like a restless cat. Downstairs at breakfast, the mood in the gull's nest was dampened further by the presence of Constable Green, whose trench coat still carried the scent of the morning fog. "We've recovered Edward Marchmont's wallet," he announced, standing stiffly in the hallway. "Found just off Drift Hollow Trail close to where the coat turned up. There's no sign of Mrs. Marchmont, however." Mrs. Fanshawe wrung her hands. "Still no trace of her? She wouldn't just vanish, would she?" Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly. "Not unless she intended to, or was persuaded to." The constable frowned. There were no footprints heading toward the road, but the ground was muddy. Any tracks could have washed out. Miss Marple looked up, eyes sharp. "But you found the coat? It didn't wash away?" She rose from the breakfast table after excusing herself, borrowed a pair of Mrs. Fanshawe's walking boots, and set out toward Drift Hollow. The path was narrow and unkind, flanked by wild gorse and slate stones, slick with mist. She moved slowly, scanning the trail not just for footprints but for signs of human hesitation: dragged feet, broken bracken, a snag of fabric. Halfway down, something caught the light, just barely. She knelt beside a thistle bush. Tucked in the damp earth was a single pearl earring, still gleaming faintly. Clara Marchmont had been wearing pearls the morning Miss Marple saw her. 2 earrings. Now only 1 remained. That was no accident. Further along the trail, Miss Marple noticed something else: faint depressions in the earth. Not boot prints, but the kind made by a walking stick or cane. 2 distinct jabs, then none. The trail ended abruptly at a sharp drop. Returning to the gull's nest by mid-afternoon, she was greeted with unexpected news. "Jane," Harriet said in a hushed voice, "there's a man here. Claims to be a friend of Edward's. He says he just arrived from London." Miss Marple followed her into the lounge, where a tall man in his early 30s stood by the mantelpiece, drying his gloves. He looked like a man used to rain, but not to grief. "Patrick Elms," he said smoothly. "Edward and I were friends at university. He mentioned this honeymoon, and when I didn't hear from him, I became concerned." Miss Marple tilted her head, studying him. "You came all this way because of concern?" "He and I had unfinished conversations," Patrick said, choosing his words carefully. "He was having second thoughts, about marriage, I mean, said he and Clara were mismatched." "Did you know Clara well?" "I met her once, enough to know she wasn't particularly warm." He glanced away. "But Edward was the sort who tried to fix what couldn't be mended." Harriet looked uneasy. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Later that evening, as the fire crackled again and guests retired early, Miss Marple caught Constable Green by the back door. "She wasn't seen after that morning, was she?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No locals reported her?" "But we just got a call. A petrol station attendant outside Hatherley remembers a woman matching her description 2 days ago, bought a map and tonic water, said she seemed composed." Miss Marple folded her arms. "Composed, not hysterical. That doesn't match a grieving widow. Unless, the constable added, she wasn't grieving. Exactly. In her room that night, Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, Clara last seen alone, not in distress. Map found in guest house. 3 odd sites marked earring, found above cliff, not below. No signs of fall or blood at the edge. Edward's wallet and coat. Too convenient. Patrick Elms. Friend or something more? She paused and underlined a final phrase. What was the pact? This didn't feel like a crime of impulse. It had texture. Planning. Possibly multiple participants. But Clara's disappearance wasn't the only riddle. Why had Edward been hesitant about marriage so soon before the wedding? And why had he agreed to a honeymoon that reportedly he hadn't wanted? Miss Marple rose from her chair and pulled back the curtain. The fog had thickened again, cloaking the cliffs in moonlight haze. Somewhere out there, a woman was either hiding or being hunted. And Miss Marple intended to find out which. Chapter 3. The Pact Unfolds. Miss Marple awoke to the hollow toll of the chapel bell, long disused but rung now and then by sea winds. The fog had receded, giving way to a brisk, bone-bright morning. From her window she could see the cliffs more clearly now, the jagged rocks like broken teeth at the base of Drift Hollow. The very place where Edward's coat had been found, almost too easily. By mid-morning she sat with Harriet in the breakfast room, poring once again over the copy of the red-marked map she'd made in her notebook. 3 locations, the chapel ruins, the old tin mine at Brine Hollow, and a moss-covered well near Wetherham Wood. These aren't romantic spots, Harriet said, stirring her tea with a slow clink. Why would someone honeymoon there? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Because someone wanted to remember something, or forget it. Constable Green arrived with updates. We've spoken to the owners of the petrol station. The woman matching Clara's description bought the map and a bottle of quinine tonic. No receipt, but their register notes the transaction at 3:15 p.m. 2 days ago. That's at least 12 hours after Edward was last confirmed alive, Miss Marple noted. She looked calm, didn't ask for directions, wore a green scarf, they said. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. Clara wore red the day they arrived. Green blinked. Maybe she changed. Or she was avoiding attention. The constable shifted uneasily. We also interviewed Patrick Elms again, said he arrived in Wetherham the day before yesterday, but no one at the inn saw him until yesterday morning. Did he say where he stayed the first night? No, claimed he slept in his car. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. How self-sufficient. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a hired car to the first marked site, the chapel ruins. The remnants of a 12th century building stood atop a rise, its stones damp with lichen and history. Ivy choked the eastern wall. A narrow wooden bench sat to the side, warped with age. She wasn't alone. A soft rustling made her turn. A young woman, barely 30, in thick glasses and a faded duffel coat, stood by the ruined altar, sketching quietly. Oh, hello, she said, startled. Didn't hear you come up. I imagine the ghosts here don't either, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Do you visit often? The woman smiled. I'm writing a thesis on pre-Reformation structures in Devon. This is one of the least catalogued sites. Miss Marple noted the notepad in her hand, filled with careful charcoal lines. Have you been here recently? She asked, glancing around. The woman frowned. Yes, a few days ago. I was surprised to find someone else here. A woman, middle height, light hair. She didn't speak, just stood there looking at the altar. Wearing a green scarf, perhaps? Yes, actually. She paused. Now that you mention it, she seemed upset. Kept folding something. A letter, I think. Miss Marple thanked her and descended the hill slowly, boots slipping in patches of moss. She returned just before twilight. Patrick Elms sat reading by the fireplace. Mr. Elms, she said softly, did Edward ever mention visiting these parts before? He looked up warily. No, why? He seemed to know the landscape rather well, marking places most people would overlook. Patrick closed the book slowly. He read local folklore, was fascinated by stories of monks hiding relics, secret covenants, things like that. Secret covenants, Miss Marple repeated. Like pacts? He didn't answer, but his knuckles had whitened. Later that evening, Harriet knocked at her door. "There's a woman on the phone for you," she whispered. Refused to give her name, just said it was urgent. Miss Marple descended the stairs and picked up the receiver behind the reception desk. A breathless voice came through. "I shouldn't be calling. They'll be watching." "Is this Clara?" Miss Marple asked softly. Silence. Then, "He lied to me. About everything. The marriage, the inheritance, the pregnancy. I didn't know until it was too late. Where are you?" But the line went dead. Miss Marple stood for a long moment, receiver still in hand. Pregnancy. That hadn't been mentioned before. She went back to her room and opened her notebook. Clara seen at chapel, distressed pregnancy, unconfirmed but possible motive, green scarf, eaten disguise, Elms hiding something, lied about arrival, no sign of forced disappearance. Clara called from somewhere near. "She's alive." She drew a line under the final note. This was not just a murder. It was a reckoning. And somewhere in the ruins of a honeymoon, the past was demanding payment in blood. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Well. The wind had shifted by morning. Weatherham by Sea, though quiet as ever, now breathed with unease. Miss Marple stood by the window of her room at the Bayview Inn, knitting needles untouched in her lap. The previous night's call echoed in her mind like a hymn half-remembered. He lied to me. The inheritance. The pregnancy. But it wasn't just what Clara had said, it was what she hadn't. She hadn't asked for help. By 11, Miss Marple and Constable Green stood near the moss-covered stone well just at the edge of Weatherham Wood, the third site circled on the map. A rusted iron grate lay cracked and half open across its mouth, its hinges stiff with age. The area smelled of wet bark and fern. "We've always thought of it as a wishing well," Green said, shining his torch into the abyss. "Children toss coins in, teenagers swear love, that sort of thing." Miss Marple squinted into the shaft. The stones were old, irregular, and slick. Something small and silver glinted faintly in the light. "Lower the torch again," she said. Green crouched. "Looks like—" "A locket," Miss Marple finished. "Can we retrieve it?" It took the constable an hour, a fishing rod from the innkeeper's son, and a great deal of patience, but eventually the locket was pulled up. Delicate, heart-shaped, scratched, but intact. Inside, there were two photographs. One of Clara, much younger, perhaps 20, smiling in front of an old church. The second, a man who was not Edward. "Would you know him?" Green asked. Miss Marple didn't answer, but her brows furrowed. She had seen that face, just once, in the framed wedding photo that sat in the Marchmont's room at the inn. In the back corner, behind the cake, a man with close-set eyes and a half-smile. Watching. "A second man," she murmured. "Always a second man." They returned to the village just as rain began to fall. At the inn, Patrick Elms stood waiting by the fireplace, a suitcase at his feet. "Leaving already?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light. Patrick smiled faintly. "My work here is done. Edward was my friend, but I hardly knew Clara. I'm not sure what's left to stay for." "Did you attend the wedding?" she asked, knitting idle rows. "No," he said. "I was out of the country." "Curious then," she said gently, "that you were captured in the wedding photo." His face faltered. She stood. "I noticed the resemblance to the man in Clara's locket, and then I remembered the name on the guest list. James Elms." "Your brother?" Patrick took a breath. "Half-brother." "Did he love Clara?" "Deeply. They were engaged once, until Edward came along." Miss Marple nodded. "And now James is missing." "No," Patrick said softly. "James is dead. 3 years now. Clara was never the same." The fire crackled behind them. Miss Marple sat again, quietly observing. "Did Edward know?" she asked. "I'm not sure," Patrick said, "but something changed between them on this trip. I saw her face once when he wasn't looking, cold, not sad, not fearful, just resolved." Miss Marple's fingers paused over her knitting. That evening, she returned alone to the old Penmire Hollow tin mine, the second red-marked site. She took the lantern Harriet insisted she bring and descended carefully down the path. The entrance was blocked by wooden beams, but just beyond, the land gave way to a hollow dip, half flooded. Near the edge, something white lay pressed in the muddy ground. She reached for it, a torn photograph, damaged by rain. Only half the image remained. It was Clara, her hand resting on a man's shoulder, but not Edward's, not Patrick's either. This man's hand wore a silver ring with a cross-shaped etching. A sudden crack of branches behind her made Miss Marple turn sharply. But it was only a badger scrambling away into the hedgerow. Still her heart thumped uncomfortably. Someone had dropped this photograph. Recently. And not without purpose. Back at the inn, she laid out the items on her table. The torn photo with the cross ring, the locket with 2 pictures, the red-marked map, Clara's voice on the phone. He lied. Inheritance. Pregnancy. She made another note. Was Clara being blackmailed? Was Edward not the father of the child? Was this trip meant to reveal or erase the past? Then at last, she drew a new line on her notepad. 3 men loved Clara. Only one survived. Outside, the church bell tolled once, just one clear note, carried by wind. Chapter 5. The Visitor in the Fog. Weatherham by Sea woke the next morning swathed in heavy fog. It rolled in from the coast like a thick, silent tide, swallowing rooftops and tree lines, turning familiar paths into ghostly corridors. The world was grey, muffled, timeless. Miss Marple, shawl around her shoulders, stepped quietly out of the Bayview Inn and toward the village post office. But before she could reach it, she spotted someone standing just at the edge of the churchyard, a man in a brown raincoat, unmoving, watching the gravestones. She recognized him instantly. Father Harlan, vicar of the seaside parish. Not a particularly warm man, but thoughtful and reserved, and lately, very silent. "I didn't expect to find you here so early," Miss Marple said gently as she approached. The vicar turned slowly. "Fog suits reflection." "Yes," she said. "And secrets." He gave a tired smile. "You're not wrong." They stood for a moment, quiet, until Miss Marple asked, "Did you know Edward Marchmont?" "Not well. I conducted the ceremony, but I remember Clara more vividly." "Do you remember seeing anyone else at their wedding? Someone Clara tried not to look at?" He blinked, surprised. "There was, yes, actually. A man sitting in the last pew, tall, dark coat, left quickly after the vows. Clara seemed shaken by him. She noted that. Did he wear a ring, perhaps? Silver? Cross-etched?" The vicar nodded slowly. "I believe he did, but why?" Miss Marple turned away slightly. "Because someone wanted Clara to remember a past she tried to bury, and someone wanted Edward out of the picture." Back at the inn, Constable Green was waiting with a folder of call records. "We finally pulled Clara's data," he said, placing it on the tea table. "Frequent contact with an unregistered number, texts around 4 a.m., 2 nights before Edward vanished." Miss Marple opened the log. One message stood out, chilling in its plainness. "You promised. The pact ends with him." She tapped the message. "And now we understand the map." Green blinked. "You think each red-marked site was part of something planned?" "Each is a place where Clara could reflect, hide something, or revisit a memory, or meet someone." That afternoon, the fog still unbroken, Miss Marple visited Drift Hollow again, the cliffside path where Edward's coat was found. She took care on the slick ground, walking until she reached the wooden barrier placed by the police. There, snagged on a thorn bush just off the path, was a strip of fine lace. part of a bridal veil. It hadn't been there before. She picked it up carefully and folded it into her handkerchief. By late evening, fog still pressing against the windows like a blanket of ghosts, someone knocked at the Bayview Inn. It was Clara, rain-drenched, trembling but alive. I couldn't stay away," she said quietly to Miss Marple, who ushered her in without a word. Constable Green remained silent in the hallway, letting the moment breathe. Clara sat by the fire, eyes wide and hollow. Her hands clutched something, a small tin box with a rusted clasp. "I want to tell the truth," she whispered. Miss Marple waited. "Edward and I," Clara began, "were not well. He married me for appearance, for what my family's name meant in business. But I didn't love him. I loved someone else. Years ago." "James Elms," Miss Marple said gently. Clara nodded. "He died in an accident, but before he did, he made me promise something. If I ever married, if I ever moved on, I had to protect a secret, one that Edward discovered." She opened the tin box. Inside was a marriage license, but not hers and Edward's. Clara Hastings and James Elms, married in secret 2 years before. "It was annulled after James's death," Clara whispered. "But Edward found the record. He used it. He said I'd lied to him, that I'd cheated him, humiliated him. He threatened to expose me, destroy my family." Miss Marple studied her. "So you made a pact?" Clara nodded, tears forming. "We agreed to go away for a while, to patch things. But I had another plan. Someone offered to help." "Who?" Miss Marple asked. The door opened behind them. Patrick Elms, Chapter 6. The Pact's Final Witness. Patrick Elms stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the firelight. The fog behind him swirled as if reluctant to let him go. Inside the Bayview Inn's lounge, time seemed to pause. Miss Marple looked up from her seat without surprise. "You've arrived just as expected, Mr. Elms," she said softly. "Do come in. It seems we've all run out of places to hide." Clara did not look at him. Her hands were clenched tightly around the rusted tin box, knuckles white. Patrick stepped in, closing the door behind him with deliberate calm. "I saw the lights," he said. "I thought maybe she came back." "She did," Miss Marple replied. "And she brought the truth with her." Clara's voice trembled. "I never meant for any of this. But when Edward found out about James, when he began using it to control me, I felt trapped." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. "And then someone offered you a way out. Someone with a memory long enough to carry grief and quiet enough to plan." Patrick's jaw tensed. "James was my brother, half-brother. But more than that, he was kind. And Clara was the only one who ever made him happy." "You knew about their secret marriage?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I found out after James died," Patrick said. "I kept it buried because it was all he had left." Clara finally looked at him. "So you helped me?" Patrick's eyes didn't waver. "I came to Weatherham to protect you. When I saw Edward growing more unstable, when I realized what he was capable of, yes, I stayed close." Miss Marple's voice, quiet and firm. "And the map?" Patrick turned to her. James's old sketch. He and Clara had once planned to elope. Those red-marked places were spots they dreamed of visiting together. Clara had the map hidden for years, but after Edward's threats, I suggested she use it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "As breadcrumbs? To fake a disappearance, perhaps?" Clara shook her head. "No, I wanted time, space to think. Patrick told me if I went to those places alone, Edward might follow, that if anything happened to me, the map would reveal it." "But something changed," Miss Marple murmured. Clara swallowed. "Yes. Edward followed me to Drift Hollow. He demanded I admit the marriage to James. I refused. We argued. He pushed me, and I fell. I hit my head." Her fingers traced a faint scar near her temple. "When I woke up, he was gone. I ran. I was terrified of him, of what he might do next. I thought he'd gone to destroy the records. I didn't know—" She broke off, tears filling her eyes. "You didn't know he was dead," Miss Marple finished. Patrick's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't kill him, I swear. When Clara disappeared, I thought she'd done something. I tried to cover her trail, to confuse the investigation, but I never—" A knock sounded at the door. Constable Green entered, raincoat glistening with mist. "I think you should hear this, Miss Marple," he said, holding up a sealed envelope. "Posted from Brighton 2 weeks ago. We traced it back to a local notary." He handed it to Clara. She opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of a revised will. Edward's, dated just 3 days before their trip. It left everything to Clara. Miss Marple's brow lifted. "Interesting timing." Clara stared at the paper. He said, "If I stayed loyal, if I gave up the past, he'd make it all mine." Green pulled another paper from his pocket. "There's more. A withdrawal receipt. Edward took out £5,000 in cash the morning they checked out of the homestay. That money is missing." Miss Marple turned to Clara. "Did he ever mention giving you money?" "No," she said. "He was controlling about finances. I didn't even know he carried cash." Patrick shook his head. "Edward never trusted banks. James told me once he used to hide money in books and glove compartments." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And where is Edward's coat now?" "In evidence," Green replied. "At the station." "Check the inner lining," she said, "just behind the left cuff." Green left at once. Clara leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" Miss Marple looked between her and Patrick. "I'm thinking," she said, "someone knew about the will. Someone wanted Clara to look guilty. And someone was at Drift Hollow that morning who didn't expect Edward to survive the argument." Patrick's voice dropped. "Are you saying someone else killed him?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, rising. "And the motive was not love but legacy." She walked to the fireplace and took the tin box from Clara's hands. Inside, beneath the marriage license, was a small pressed flower. Lavender. Her eyes narrowed. "In the Marchmont wedding photo, the bouquet Clara holds, there was no lavender. But I saw a sprig of it this morning. In the well where the locket was. Fresh." She looked at Clara. "That flower came from someone else. Someone who knew what you carried in that box, and what it would mean if it were ever found." A silence fell. Then Green returned, breathless. "There was money, folded and taped inside the lining. Exactly 5,000. Miss Marple turned to Patrick. "Did you know about that?" Patrick looked stunned. "No, I swear." Clara whispered. "Then who did?" The wind outside began to howl. The fog clung tighter, and Miss Marple quietly said, "The person who took Edward's life was watching both of you all along." Chapter 7. The fog clears back. The storm broke just before dawn. Wetherham by Sea, drenched in sea spray and sorrow, began to exhale as the fog slowly retreated. What was once veiled in grey was now revealed in the pale blue light of morning. Damp cobblestones, shuttered windows, and truths that could no longer be hidden. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table of the Bayview Inn, stirring a lukewarm cup of tea. The newspaper lay folded beside her, the headline barely visible. Local heiress Clara Marchmont, under suspicion as husband's death declared homicide. She sighed. Headlines had a way of simplifying what was never simple. Constable Green entered with a weary look. "We just received word from the forensic team," he said, removing his cap. Edward was struck from behind with a rounded object, likely a rock or heavy iron, but it wasn't fatal at first. He bled slowly. Whoever killed him left before confirming he was dead. Miss Marple looked up. Then the killer wasn't interested in making it look like an accident. They wanted it discovered. Green nodded. "And we found muddy footprints on the upper path near Drift Hollow. They don't match Clara's shoes. We've sent them for analysis." Just then, the door creaked open. Elsa Bennet stepped inside. Green blinked. The housekeeper?" Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "Do come in, Miss Bennet. We were just talking about footprints." Elsa's cheeks flushed. "I saw the newspaper," she murmured. "I needed to talk to you, before the police twisted things." Green stiffened, but Miss Marple gestured for him to wait. Elsa sat stiffly. "I lied. The morning Clara and Edward checked out, I saw someone else following them up the path toward Drift Hollow. I didn't want to get involved." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Who did you see?" A pause. "Margaret. Edward's cousin. She was at the wedding. Wore lavender in her hair." Green's brow furrowed. "But she left the day after, didn't she?" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "She stayed the night at the White Mare Lodge on the edge of town. I confirmed it yesterday afternoon, under a false name." Elsa's hands trembled. "She and Edward? They argued. Often? I overheard one of them before the wedding. She said something about the will, that it should have been hers." Miss Marple nodded. "Margaret Marchmont, Edward's only surviving blood relative, estranged but clever, and very bitter." Green's eyes widened. "You think she found out Clara would inherit everything?" "I believe she did," Miss Marple said. "And when Edward foolishly flaunted it, Margaret saw her chance. She followed them that morning, waited until Edward was alone, struck him, then vanished before Clara woke." Green exhaled. "And planted the lavender?" Miss Marple gave a small smile. "A subtle signature, the very flower she wore in her hair at the wedding, and one Clara was known to hate. It wouldn't occur to Clara to carry it in her memory box." Elsa swallowed. "I think she wanted Clara blamed." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "A widow with motive, secrets, and silence. It nearly worked." Later that day, Margaret Marchmont was quietly arrested at a railway station in Sussex. She carried a fake passport and just under £5,000 in cash. She denied everything, at first. But her hotel room held damning evidence, the missing map with Edward's blood on its edge, and a handwritten note torn from Edward's own journal. "She wants it all, the family name, the inheritance. I must revise the will before she takes it from Clara." Green returned that evening with the final report. "It's done. Margaret's confessed. She said she couldn't bear to watch the Marchmont legacy handed to a stranger bride." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "And so she ensured the bride became a suspect. It's always remarkable, Constable, how jealousy disguises itself as tradition." That evening, Clara sat on a garden bench overlooking the bay. The fog had lifted, replaced by golden light on the water. Miss Marple joined her, offering a fresh cup of tea. "I still don't know how to forgive myself," Clara whispered. "For hiding, for not stopping him." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on hers. "You were caught between grief and fear, but you came back. That's what matters." Clara looked out over the waves. "Patrick's leaving. Says there's too much of James in me for him to stay." Miss Marple gave a soft smile. "Sometimes that's the kindest decision of all." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the village bells began to toll softly. Miss Marple rose from the bench. Another mystery concluded, but she knew well. The sea always held more secrets. And so did people. Chapter 8. Under the Harvest Moon. A full month had passed since the fog lifted from Wetherham by Sea, and from the lives left frayed in the wake of Edward Marchmont's death. The air had turned crisper now. Autumn painted the trees along the coast in hues of copper and russet. The scent of sea salt mingled with drying leaves. It was the eve of the harvest festival. Atop the village green, bunting swayed gently in the breeze, and townsfolk bustled about with apple tarts, wool shawls, and crates of cider. Lanterns hung from the old oak in the square, casting golden flickers onto cobblestone. But down the lane, in a quieter part of town, Miss Marple sat once again in her usual wicker chair beside the hearth at Bayview Cottage. A fire crackled warmly, and the faint murmur of village music drifted in through the cracked window. On her lap rested a small parcel wrapped in waxed brown paper. She opened it carefully. Inside, a folded letter, a pressed sprig of lavender, and a photograph, black and white, slightly faded. It showed 3 figures standing at the cliff edge of Drift Hollow. Clara, Edward, and Margaret, smiling stiffly behind them. The note read, "I never learned how to let go of what I thought I was owed. Tell Clara I was wrong about her. I only saw ghosts." Miss Marple studied the handwriting. There was no return address. She folded the letter neatly, slipping it into a drawer. Later that evening, she wandered down to the churchyard where the village had gathered for the harvest moon lighting. Children ran with paper lanterns shaped like pumpkins, and a choir hummed softly beneath the chapel arch. Miss Marple spotted Clara standing beside Eleanor Marchmont, now recovered and calmer. Both wore soft smiles, hands clasped tightly. Clara turned as Miss Marple approached. "You came?" "I always do," Miss Marple said gently. "The moon never looks quite so large as it does on nights like this." Clara nodded. "It was on a night just like this that we arrived here, and everything began to unravel." "Or," Miss Marple countered, "began to mend." They stood in silence as the harvest moon rose, full and heavy, casting pale gold over the stone walls, over the cliff path, over all the secrets once buried in shadow. And for a moment there was stillness, peace, redemption, and the soft ringing of chapel bells long since rusted, echoing faintly into the night.